come to this webinar of Aryabhatta College. It's a pleasure to receive you, ma'am. And the Department of History has been one of the most active departments in our college during these hard times, COVID times. The times are new, as you realize. All of us are locked up everywhere, and that they have utilized this time to conduct a series of webinars for the benefit of the students is something that heartens my gives me good feeling in my heart, heartens me up. That you are today going to speak on kingship in the time in the
times of Kushana period.
period. So is something that is in continuity of much that we have discussed Mauryan period and prior to this. So it comes in continuity, and therefore it is going to enlighten our students in many good ways, and also the by effect of it. So renew a few things in their mind and touch up many. But my congratulations to history, the whole history department, which has been most indulgent with their students, ongoing learning teaching methods that we have adopted now. And once again, a very, very warm welcome to you, Pallavi ma'am, for coming to. Thank you.
Thank you. The pleasure is mine as well, because this has given me an opportunity to kind of express my views and discuss certain concepts that I've been talking about in my book and otherwise. The topic of today's webinar is concept of kingship during the Kushana period, change and continuity. And I would like to reiterate that Kushana period, when I talk about Kushana period and the changes which happened in the Kushana period, it is something which has to be, talked about from the earlier period. So we can appreciate change and look at continuities only when we talk about the preceding period and the succeeding period. So it's not just about Kushana period. I will talk about the concept of kingship as it's developed in early India, and bring it down to the Kushana period, how the concept developed over a period of time. So it is going to be a little longish kind of a talk. And yes, the pleasure is all mine. And right from the onset, I will want to thank the faculty members for joining in, Principal Dr. Manoj Sinha, to kind of giving me this opportunity, the organizers of the Tathagat and Arhan. I think these are the societies. And a special thanks to the History Department of Aryabhatta College for providing us a platform where we can kind of exchange ideas and express ourselves and exchange thoughts over various things. So I think I will begin with my topic. So the concept of kingship is something which has never been a static concept. And when we talk about when we think about a king, there's a certain kind of an imagery that comes to our mind. And but I will kind of talk about the changes in that imagery and how that kind of imagery that we have in our mind today developed over a period of time. As far as sources are concerned, I will, for the Kushana period, we largely have numismatic sources and inscriptional sources. So I would want to kind of focus on coins of Kushans and the inscription and the depository of the art of the Kushana period and the preceding period as well. Because in the ancient times, when you did not have the various mediums of propaganda, the kings tried to impress and awe their subjects by disseminating their images. So imagery played a very important role in kind of disseminating the ideal of a kingship and how the king is. So in that sense, I will show some slides as well, which will kind of help us to appreciate the changes in the imagery and like the kind of changes and the departures and the continuities that we find in the concept of kingship. So I would like to begin from the Rigvedic period, because that's the earliest text that we find in the context of India, and it is the oldest written material that we find, or text that we find in the world context as well. So in the Rigvedic Samhita, in the family books of the Rigvedic Samhita, we do find reference to the word Rajan or Rajanya, and that is something which comes up like that we that occurs many times. So it's not a singular reference, but many times it comes in the family books. In book 7, we have this reference to Dashrajanya Yuddha, where King Sudas he fought against a confederacy of a confederacy of 10 tribes on the banks of Ravi. So the word Rajan occurs in the family book several times, but the kind of impression that we get is of a chieftainship. So when the Raja is referred to in the Rigvedic text, it is more like a tribal chieftain. He is the protector of his Jan. So he's the protector of his people. He is the one who led them to victory in war, and he's fighting for cattle and sometimes water. He is not the protector of the territory. The concept of the territory or the kshetra is not there. He's also referred to as Janashya Gop. So he's like a gop, that is a cowherder who kind of who is taking care of his people and who is protecting his people and their cattle and leading them to victory. The clansmen offered him a tribute called Bali, which was periodically offered to him, and it's a voluntary kind of a tribute. So the Rajan did receive gifts. He presided over the Samiti, which was the large assembly of the common people. Rigvedic society being a ranked society, I would say that the Rajan was more like first among equals. He was mostly elected, and he was chosen as the Rajan. He was chosen from the people, and he was chosen as the Rajan because of his qualities, that he could lead them in war. Uh, but this entire scenario changes a little bit in the later Vedic context, and the later Vedic text. They reflect a transition from a tribal polity, the transition from a tribal polity to a territorial state. So the society is in a flux, the polity is changing, the society is changing, and people are settling down in the later Vedic phase. And the Rajan still leads them in the war. His primary duty is to get them victory in the wars. But at the same time, now he is also seen as the sustainer of the Rashtra. So that idea of a Rashtra, he is the protector of the people and the settlement. He is the protector of the Kshetra as well. So that is an idea that develops in the later Vedic phase. So he protects his people, he protects the settlement, and especially the Brahmins. And this is something that we get from the texts which are written by the Brahmins. So he's seen as a protector of the Brahmins because of the nature of the texts, which are religious in nature. He's also seen as the custodian of the social order in the later Vedic phase onwards. And the supremacy of Rajan is achieved by, it is achieved by establishing a coercive mechanism, and he tries to gain control over the productive resources of the area. So that's the process which is happening, and it's still not complete in the later Vedic phase. It is a process. It is an ongoing process in the later Vedic phase, and we hear of hereditary kingship. So most of the time the Rajan is not chosen. He's not chosen among the people, but he becomes the Raja because he belongs to a family. So the whole idea of hereditary kingship comes up in the later Vedic phase, and in the Shatapad Brahman and the Atriya Brahman, there are references to kingdoms of 10 generations, the Dash Purusham Rajya, where kingship had remained in a family for around 10 generations. We also have reference to Rajya, where the kingship remained in a family for 3 generations or 4 generations, but it could go on till 10 generations. But what is interesting is that after 10 generations also, kings could be kind of dislodged. and new kings could be put in their place. That was more like an exception instead of a rule. So the rule that we have in the later Vedic phase onwards is of hereditary kingship, and this entire concept of hereditary kingship is established in the later Vedic phase. Several rituals are introduced to exalt the position of the king, and to to show his supremacy over his people and the kinsmen. And as the wielder of supreme political power, the distance between the king, the people, and the kingsmen had to be emphasized. And for that distance, we find several kind of yagyas which were organized: the Vajpayee yagya, the Rajsui yagya, the Ashwamedh yagya, etc. So several rituals are there which kind of emphasize that the king, since only the kings could kind of perform these yagyas and gain an exalted status. They could become samrat by performing the Vajpayee yagya. So there we can find this deliberate process of distancing between the common man and the king from the later Vedic phase onwards. During these yagyas that were organized, these rituals, so several kind of contests were organized, and this context kind of they are a reminiscence of the past, when the kings were chosen because of their qualities and because of their their worthiness was judged in these contexts. So during the Vajpayee yagya, we find a chariot race is organized. During the Rajsui Yagya, a cattle raid is organized. There are games of dice. The only difference is that in the earlier phase, maybe the kings were, those who could prove their worthiness in these kind of contests were chosen as the king. But by the time we come to the later Vedic phase, these were just mock drills. So सिर्फ एक स्वांग रचाया जाता था कि ये contest हो रहा है, and but the match was already fixed. The king had to win these races. They just pretended to kind of participate in the races, and the king kind of was, it was a pre-decided kind of a match where the king would win in the chariot race, the king would win in the cattle raid, and so this is how it was. The ritual was enacted in which the victory of the Rajan was predetermined. And this is a way of kind of emphasizing the superiority of the or the supremacy of the king over his kinsman, that he's better than his kinsman, although it was a fixed kind of a thing. So attempts were provided to legitimize the authority of the king through ideology. And in the Aitreya Brahman, there is this reference that the gods elected a king who led them to victory, who led them to victory against demons, because they needed a king to kind of organize them. The demons were better organized because they had a king. The gods did not have a king, so that was that necessitated. So that kind of necessitated choosing of a king. And the kings were so that was an ideology which was provided for the need of a king. And in the Shatapad Brahman also, there is another kind of another kind of simile which is used, that after the performance of these yagyas, the king becomes one. He becomes a reflection of Prajapati actually. So yeah. So in the Shatapad, this is in the Shatapad Brahman. Shatapad Brahman asserts that the king gains identity with Prajapati through the performance of the Vajpayee yagya and the Rajsui sacrifice. So that that identification with Prajapati, who's the god, is something that we come across in the later Vedic text. Although we should see this only as a process of exalting the position of the king, and it is not like investing him with divinity, but kind of giving him an exalted status. So the attempt is there to exalt the status of the king from his kinsmen. And we also find, because of the coercive mechanisms that were introduced during this time, the king gains a greater control over the productive resources. And Bali, which was earlier offered to him periodically, and which was supposed to be a voluntary kind of an offering, becomes an obligatory offering. So the Rajan did get a share as Bali. And the Shatpat Brahman says that the Vaishya offered Bali to the Rajan because the Vaishya was under the watch of the king. So he was under the control of the king. The king is referred to as the Vishmatta, that is the eater of the wish. But we doubt that a regular system of taxation was introduced during this time, and the administrative system that we find reference to in the later Vedic text is also rudimentary. So on one hand, ceremonies like Rajsuya, Vajpayee, Ashwamedh, etc. were performed to kind of exalt the status of the king. But on the other hand, we find there were constraints to it because the king did not have a standing army. Because of the lack of the standing army, the king is advised to eat from the same vessel as they wish to gain victory in the war. Because you don't have a standing army, you can't fight on your own. You need the support of your kinsmen in the battlefield. So that is why, although there is this there is this attempt to exalt his status and to distance the king from the kinsmen, but it could not have been achieved in the later Vedic phase in absence of a regular standing army. But towards the end of the 6th century BC, when we enter the historic phase, when we have the emergence of Mahajanpadas, that's the time when we have reference to very clear reference to territorial states and monarchies and Ganasanghas. That's the time when we hear of standing army and Seni Bimbisar of Magadh of the Haryank dynasty or Haryank Kul is the one who's credited to have a standing army, and that kind of liberated the king from that dependence on his kinsmen for victory in war. So from that time onward, when you have a standing army, the position of the king is, it becomes independent of the support of the kinsmen, and that kind of definitely raises him to a very higher platform. We have rulers of Magadh. Magadh becomes the rulers of Magadh, they carve out a large empire in after the 6th century BC, and we know Mahapadmanand had a huge army, and with the help of this huge army, he conquered a very large part of North India, and he carved out a huge Nanda empire. We know about the Nanda army from the Greek sources, and it has been said that the army of Dhananand consisted of 2 lakh infantry. 2 lakh infantry, 20,000 cavalry, 2,000 chariot, and 3,000 to 6,000 elephants. That's the size of the army. It may have been exaggerated, but what we know clearly is that now the kings, they had that control over the entire productive resources, and they had control over the coercive mechanism. They had that complete control over the coercive mechanism, and they had a large formidable army. And this is something
ma'am, just to disrupt you there, your voice is breaking. That's one. Secondly, ma'am, slight bit bilingual. I'm getting messages in private for bilingual requests. So just that, ma'am.
Okay, yes. So I don't know what to do if the voice is breaking. Should I just okay. So I will talk. I will be bilingual now. Till now I have talked about the Vedic phase. अभी तक मैंने वैदिक काल की बात करी है, और वैदिक काल में जब हम ऋग्वेद की बात करते हैं तो राजन शब्द का प्रयोग कई बार उसका राजन शब्द का उल्लेख मिलता है. लेकिन राजन शब्द का जब उल्लेख मिलता है तो वो एक chieftain के रूप में है, जिसमें राजा जो है वो इक्वल है. वो सभी जो क्लान्समैन है, जो किंग्समैन है, उनके बीच में उसके रैंक, ऋग्वेदिक सोसाइटी रैंक सोसाइटी है, तो उसके रैंक जो है वो प्रथम है, क्योंकि वो युद्ध में विजय दिलाता है. वो कोई क्षेत्र का राजा नहीं है, वो अपने जन का राजा है, और इसलिए उसको जनश्व गोप भी कहा जाता है. तो और उसको बलि मिलती है, लेकिन वो बलि जो है वो एक वॉलंटरी ऑफरिंग है। और जब भी जो लूट का माल होता था युद्ध के बाद, उसका जब बंटवारा होता था तो उसका एक बड़ा हिस्सा राजन को दिया जाता होगा। लेकिन एक रेगुलर काइंड ऑफ एक बहुत ही नियमित रूप से कोई कर की व्यवस्था हमको ऋग्वैदिक काल में भी नहीं नजर आती है, और हमें उत्तर वैदिक काल में भी उस प्रकार की व्यवस्था नहीं नजर आती है। उत्तर वैदिक काल में विभिन्न प्रकार के जो अनुष्ठान है उनके द्वारा राजा की जो पोजीशनिंग है उसको एग्जॉल्ट करने का प्रयास किया जाता है, जिसमें वाजपेयी यज्ञ, राजसूय यज्ञ, अश्वमेध यज्ञ है, जिनके माध्यम से राजा और जो आम जन है उनके बीच का जो उनके बीच की दूरी जो है उस पर एम्फेसिस किया जाता है कि राजा जो है वो प्रमुख है, वो उसकी पोजीशन जो है वो आम लोगों की तरह नहीं है, उसको एक स्पेशल पोजीशन है, एग्जॉल्टेड पोजीशन है। पूरी हम देखते हैं जो उत्तर वैदिक जो टेक्स्ट है उसके अंदर जैसे ऐसे ब्राह्मण में कहा जाता है कि वाजपेयी यज्ञ और वाजपेयी यज्ञ के बाद राजा जो है वो प्रजापति के समान हो जाता है, उसमें प्रजापति की क्वालिटीज आ जाती है। तो एक तरीके से राजा को देवताओं से जोड़ने का प्रयास किया जाता है, और वो उसको विषमत भी बोला जाता है, क्योंकि राजा वैश्य से बलपूर्वक बलि ले सकता था। वो बलि जो है वो एक तरीके से काफी रेगुलर हो जाता है, लेकिन फिर भी उस प्रकार से जैसा हमें एक बहुत रेगुलर टैक्सेशन सिस्टम नजर आता है वो नहीं है, लेकिन वॉलंटरी नहीं होता है। अब अपनी मर्जी से बलि नहीं दी जाती है, बल्कि राजा बलि डिमांड करता है, क्योंकि उसके पास कोर्सिव मैकेनिज्म है, उत्पीड़क शक्ति आ गई थी राजा के पास उत्तर वैदिक काल में, और उसकी जो उसको अपने शक्ति का प्रयोग वो लोगों से बलपूर्वक बलि लेने में कर सकता था और करता था। किंतु हम देखते हैं इस काल में एक तरफ तो राजा की जो स्थिति है वो सुदृढ़ होती चली जा रही है, वो बाकी लोगों से उसका महत्व जो है समाज में बढ़ता चला जा रहा है, पूरी राजनीतिक व्यवस्था में उसको सुप्रीम माना जा रहा है। लेकिन दूसरी तरफ हम देखते हैं एक नियमित सेना के अभाव में राजा की शक्ति का एक सीमा थी। युद्ध में जीत दिलाने के लिए उसको अपने जो अन्य किंग्समैन थे उनकी सहायता चाहिए थी, उनकी सहायता के बिना वो युद्ध में जीत नहीं दिला सकता था। और ये इसकी वजह से हम एक फुल फ्लेजेड टेरिटोरियल स्टेट जो है उत्तर वैदिक काल के जिस प्रकार का डिस्क्रिप्शन हमें मिलता है उसमें नहीं देखते हैं। It is almost at the verge of a territorial state, but it is actually not there because of this absence of a standing army. लेकिन छठी शताब्दी ईसा पूर्व के बाद से जब से हमें षोडश महाजनपदों का रिपीटेड उल्लेख नजर मिलता है, उससे हमें पता चलता है कि क्षेत्रीय राज्यों का विस्तार और उनका उद्भव हो चुका था। और इनके जो राजा थे मुनाकी का हमें उल्लेख मिलता है, और हमें गढ़ संघों का उल्लेख मिलता है। और मुनाक्स की अगर हम बात करेंगे, उनमें जो राजा थे उनके पास एक नियमित सेना का प्रावधान आ चुका था। तो सैन्य बिंबिसार जो है, जो कि मगध का राजा है, हर्यंक कुल का है, उसको पहला राजा माना जाता है हिस्ट्री में जिसके पास अपनी एक सेना थी, इसलिए उसको सैन्य बिंबिसार का टाइटल दिया जाता है। और हम देखते हैं कि नंद जो वंश ने एक बड़े राज्य की जो स्थापना की वो भी इसीलिए संभव हो पाई थी कि नंद राजाओं के पास एक बड़ी विशाल सेना थी, जिसका उल्लेख हमें जो यूनानी स्रोत जो है अलेक्जेंडर के जो हिस्टोरियन साथ में आए थे उन्होंने लिखा है, फिर उसके बाद वो उनकी जो प्रतिलिपियां बनाई गई तो उनमें हमें उसका उल्लेख मिलता है। हो सकता है ये उल्लेख जो है, जो जितनी बड़ी सेना का उल्लेख मिलता है, ये अतिशयोक्तिपूर्ण हो, लेकिन इससे हमें ये तो पता चलता है कि नंद राजाओं की सेना जो थी वो विशाल थी और वो एक टक्कर देने लायक सेना थी, जिससे डर कर तो नहीं कहेंगे, लेकिन अलेक्जेंडर की जो सैनिक थे वो नहीं नंद सेना का सामना करना चाहते थे। तो it did have that kind of it was a formidable army during that time. So इस सेना में कहते हैं 2 लाख के आसपास इन्फेंट्री थी, पैदल सैनिक थे, 20 लाख के आसपास 20,000 के आसपास घुड़सवार थे, 2,000 के आसपास रथ थे, 3 से 6,000 के आसपास हस्ती बल था। तो इस प्रकार हम कह सकते हैं कि एक विशाल सेना का निर्माण जो है वो नंद काल तक तो डेफिनेटली हो चुका था, और राजाओं की, इससे राजा की जो शक्ति जो है उसमें काफी ज्यादा इजाफा हुआ, क्योंकि अब उसको अपने बंधुजनों के ऊपर डिपेंड नहीं होना था अपने 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 बल का प्रयोग करने के लिए. So a standing army, a professional standing army goes a long way in kind of establishing the supremacy of the king over a large territory. And in fact, the large territory could not have been carved out without a professional standing army. So that brings us down to the Mauryan period. So during the Mauryan period, Megasthenes talks about the military administration, and he says that there were 6 committees of 5 members each, looking after different wings of the army. So the 6 committees look up, like we have one committee each looking after the navy, the infantry, the cavalry, the elephants, and there was another committee that looked after the logistics of the army. And if you have a committee that look after the logistics of the army,
excuse me, ma'am. Excuse me, ma'am. Hello. Excuse me, ma'am. I would just take 2 minutes. Ma'am, your voice is again getting fluctuated. I think there is improper internet connection.
Now we come to the Mauryan period, and from this period onwards, we have, So now I want to share screen, and I will want to show some of the slides that I have arranged. And enable the screen. Hello.
For the screen sharing, ma'am.
Yeah, I want to request you.
Namita ma'am, ma'am screen share kar rahi.
So I want to share the screen now, and then so when we come to the Mauryan period, we have the Mauryan inscriptions, which is the voice of the Emperor Ashok, and some of these art objects that we find, which kind of this is the art. We can look at. I don't think I have to enter people from the waiting room. Okay. So coming to the Mauryan period, the kind of kingship, or the concept of kingship that we come across during the Mauryan period is it is a unique kind of a kingship, because the Mauryans did not issue dynastic coinage, but then the power of the Mauryan Empire or the Mauryan Emperor is something which was unparalleled. The way Ashoka gives his commands to his officials in his inscriptions is something which exudes power. There is no doubt about his power, and it is a secular kind of a kingship. There is no, you don't find that comparison with gods in the Mauryan time period. If you look at Arthashastra also, there the king is the epitome of power. He is the supreme authority in the state. He is the first limb of the state. But at the same time, that that comparison with gods or with the divine authority is something that we don't find in the Mauryan period. And so that in that sense, it was quite a secular kind of a kingship that we have during the Mauryas. Although they did not issue dynastic coins, because this whole idea of a state issuing coins had not developed during that time. In the Mauryan in the Mauryan inscription, what we find is that Ashoka's ideal of kingship included welfare of all beings. So it is a welfare, that, and there is a lot of emphasis on the welfare of the subject, and he emphasizes on that being his primary duty of all beings and his subject in this world, and he wanted their happiness in this world and the other world. There is this recurring concept of a debt. He speaks of a debt that he owes to all living beings in the Rock Edict 6, and he wanted to discharge his debt by planting trees along roads, by digging wells, by providing medical facilities for people and animals. So this concept that the king is supreme, definitely, but he owes a debt to his people. He has to take care of the welfare of those people, is a very recurrent kind of a concept that we find in the Ashokan inscriptions, which reveal the voice and the ideas of King Ashok. There are some incidental references to administration in the Ashokan inscription, which kind of reaffirm reaffirm the idea that that there was an elaborate bureaucracy and an administrative mechanism under the Mauryas. The Arthashastra presents a state that controls people, produce, and resources of its domain. But Arthashastra is a normative kind of a text. It puts across a set of ideals which were not always the reality. But when Ashoka is giving command to his people, to the Yuktas, Rajukas, Pradeshikas, Kumars, Mahamatras, Ant Mahamatras, etc. From that we know that we do have a elaborate administration and an elaborate bureaucracy under the Mauryas, which was there. And in the Mauryan Empire, we come across a sophisticated monumental stone sculptures, which was the manifestation of the imperial ideology and the vision of the Mauryan state. So the Ashokan pillars that we come across, they stand as imperial monuments bearing the king's message and his message about the code of conduct to his people. And the first thing that comes to our mind when we look at the Ashokan pillars and the Ashokan the capitals of the Ashokan pillars is these majestic figures that we have. So these Ashokan pillars, they were above these Ashokan pillars, these monolithic pillars, we had these capitals like this one, the lion capital from Sarnath, where we have these 4 lions. And it kind of it could have meant to kind of emphasize that the Mauryas had they have control over all the 4 directions. So the line of the Mauryan state is kind of roaring in all 4 directions. They have this control over the entire subcontinent. The idea of the Chakravarti is something that comes across in through these capitals that we find during the Mauryan period. So we find this chakra there, which can be interpreted as a Buddhist is the symbols of authority, symbols of a Chakravarti ruler were kind of seen in the Mauryan pillar, the capitals of the Mauryan pillars. So we find that the lion capital would have looked like this. The freestanding Ashokan pillars would have looked like this, impressing people on the highways. People who went about on the highways would have the idea being to put people under awe, to kind of impress people with this majestic portrayal of these animals which were seen as powerful animals. So we have the lion, we have the bull, we have the horse, we have the elephant. These four animals are seen in the capitals of the modern pillars of the Ashokan pillars, and we also find them. We also find them uh, in the lower portion of the capital, like this, the galloping horse. These can be interpreted as Buddhist symbols as well, but at the same time, these are very, very powerful symbols that kind of emphasize the power of the modern state and the power of the king. That especially the Dharma Chakra, the elephant. We have an elephant from Sankisa. So this is an elephant where you don't find the tusk, but the elephant is there. From Sankissa, the bull of Rampurva. Yeah, again a very, very powerful image of the bull, and the lion capitals. We find these lion capitals. The four lions are seen at Sarnath. In the Sarnath capital, we also have the same line is repeated in the Sanchi capital as well, and we find the singular line at Vaishali and other places. And definitely these were very majestic. These freestanding pillars, they symbolized, they could have symbolized the axis of the world. Some historians have interpreted the freestanding pillars as symbolizing the axis of the world, that is the axis mundi, which separated heaven and the earth. But whether that's correct or not, we don't know. But at least they did symbolize the majesty of the these various kind of images which kind of emphasize power, and these are symbols of a Chakravarti king. The Chakravarti, the horse, the elephant, the chakra, etc., are seen as part of the treasures of a Chakravarti king. So maybe that is the idea which is kind of which the modern king, or the which Ashoka tried to disseminate among his people. There is another thing which is peculiar, or which is unique about the modern or the Ashokan ideology of kingship, is that there is this paternalistic ideal. In Rock Edict 1 and 2, Ashoka says, "All men are my children, and as I desire welfare and happiness of my children in this world and the next world, I desire the same for all men." So again, we find that it is a paternalistic kind of an ideal which has been put forth in the Ashokan inscriptions, and it is paternalistic. It is the idea of rid is that we these in his realm. He talks about Brahmins and Shramas in the same breath, and he repeatedly says, "I respect Brahmins and Shramas and all the sects that existed, that were there, that all religion equally." Although Ashok he had become a Buddhist, but he kind of did not kind of lay any premium on the Buddhist religion. He always talks about Brahmins first. It is always Brahmins and Shramans, and never just in these major rock edicts and the pillar edicts, he never talks about his personal religion. It is always about the code of conduct of the Ashokan Dhamma that he was trying to propagate among his people. We also find that in the Ashokan inscriptions, he calls himself Devanam Piya Piyadasi. So this is something which I find interesting. That if we look at Ashok Vadan, the reference that we get in Ashok Vadan is that Ashok was disliked by his father because he was ugly. But in the Ashokan inscription, he writes, the opening sentence is always Priyadarshi. So he writes, he's someone who's good to look at, who's maybe handsome. So probably he tried to impress people that he is good to look at. Whereas we don't know what is correct. We don't know whether the description that we get in Ashokavaran is correct, or the description that we get from the Ashokan inscription is correct. But there is this attempt to kind of, impress people by telling them that he is liked by God, he is beloved of God, he's Devanam Piya, beloved of the gods, is liked by God because of his welfare activities, and he's good to look at. So the royal propaganda was at play here, where he tried to kind of impress people through these various very, very powerful images that tried to disseminate the idea of kingship during the Mauryan period. So one more thing, he calls himself Raja of Magad in a minor inscription, and where we get his name, it's always it's only Raja Ashok. So it kind of tells us that there was no other Raja that existed in the domain of Ashok, in the Mauryan domain, because only saying Raja was sufficient. So that means that he had that complete authority over his domain, and no other smaller Rajas existed in his domain. This is something which changes when we come to the post-Mauryan time, especially the Kushana time. And it's not something which happens in the Kushana time. This is something that changes in the concept of kingship forever as we enter the post-Mauryan time, where things start assuming very, very, very pompous titles, high-sounding titles. So coming to the Kushans now, I will just tell you about the background of the Kushans. The Kushans belong to the Yuchi tribe, and they made a transition from a nomadic tribe to a sedentary agrarian trading state polity through a process of involuntary migration and strategic conquest. These are the people who had a tribal affiliation. They moved, they were Central Asian steppes people, and they moved and they came to kind of control Bactria. And from Bactria, and using the resources of Bactria, which were agricultural resources, they started spreading towards the east, and they started spreading towards south and east. Then they carved out a huge empire stretching up to River Ganga, and a large part of North India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, some parts of erstwhile Soviet Russia were a part of this intercontinental huge Kushana empire. But we need to remember that winning a territory was a much easier task in comparison to welding together these heterogeneous elements and to establish the supreme authority over the Kushanas, over the vanquished people. They had come to control a territory which was inhabited by people of different ethnicities. People spoke different language. They adhered to different religion. So we have immense diversity in terms of ethnicity, language, religion, etc. in the Kushana realm, and it was a greater task. It was a Herculean task to kind of impress the people with impress these diverse elements. So we find that if we look at the political process under the Kushans, we find that the invasion that happened under the Kushan was of a mild form, and it allowed coexistence of prevailing cultures, and there was a lot of scope for acculturation within a superordinate political system, and to exercise that kind of a control. Okay, I have to allow guests. Okay, so to kind of exercise that kind of a control, they successfully utilized religion as an instrument of statecraft. Their part used to kind of legitimize the Kushana rule. So divinity of kingship seems to be the most conspicuous element of the Kushana political system. The Kushana monarchs, the Kushana monarchs, so I have to admit
And if you click on the tab called participants, you will get a parallel window to your left hand of the screen, and you will have to just go onto the onto the top right cursor, say admit all.
Yeah. So I have admitted. Yeah. Okay. So, so coming back to the political ideology that was disseminated by the Kushana emperors, we find that divinity of kingship is the most conspicuous element of. Just a second. So, what do you want me to do? Society. Then there are more people who keep coming. No, I have to admit them. Okay, so the Kushana monarchs, they assumed high-sounding titles and divine titles like Devputra. तो हम जब कुशानों की बात करते हैं तो अब हम उस फेज में एंटर करते हैं जब डायनेस्टिक कॉइनेज शुरू हो जाता है. The Kushans issued dynastic coinage, so that is something which is which is something which begins with the Kushana dynasty. Although the Indo-Greeks issued some coins, but this large scale issuing of coins of dynastic coins is something that comes that begins that comes with the Kushans, because they are the ones who had a very robust monetary system and a very robust coinage. And it is through these coins and through these various kind of sculptural images that they try to disseminate the idea of a very powerful and a divine kind of a kingship. So the Kushana monarchs, they assume the title Devputra, that is son of God, and this is in their inscription, and this corresponds to the Chinese imperial title of Tianzu, which is son of heaven. So the Kushana empire is not an insular kind of an empire. They were in there is a lot of cross-cultural transmission of ideas, sharing of ideas, and they kind of adopted this idea from the Chinese empire, and they adopted this title of Devputra, that is son of God. We also find in one of the inscription, which is the Kamra inscription, that the Kushana ruler Vashishka, he is described as Dev Manush. So Dev Manush is God as man, or God living in the form of man. So again, that very close connection between God, between the divine form of Kushana kingship is something that is reiterated in various kinds of inscriptions. If we look at the Rapthak inscription, which is the longest inscription of year 1 of Kanishka, there Kanishka is referred to as Bago, that is in the Bactrian language, that means God. So he is called the God, he is called worthy of divine worship. So it's not just normal kind of a worship, but he is someone who's seen as worthy of divine worship. And the Rapthak inscription clearly talks about construction of a Devkul, that is Devkul or Bagolango, which is a god house, which was like a dynastic sanctuary in which deceased as well as living Kushana kings were deified, and the statues were set up for worship in these Devkuls. So Devkuls or Bagolangos, they were like god houses where you have statues of the gods which were to be worshipped, and the statues of these kings, which were for worship or not, we don't know. But then the worship. So the statues of these Kushana kings were put inside the inside the Devkuls, and probably these kings were also worshipped. The deceased kings were worshipped, and the living kings were also worshipped, because when Kanishka is ordering the construction of the Bagolango, that is a god house, he is living, and when he is ordering that these are the statues which have to be installed in the dynastic century. He talks about Nana, Ahura Mazda, Uma, Mihira, and along with that, his grandfather, great grandfather, his father, and his statue. So we find that this is something which happened only like in the Indian context. This is something that we find only in the Kushana context, where the statues of the kings were almost placed parallel to the statues of the gods. So the effigies of Kushana emperors, they were possibly installed along with the ideals of different deities at. We have recovered these statues from two places, from Mat and from Surkh Kotal in Afghanistan, and probably there were more such statues which we have not recovered from Ertam, Dashtanavur, Dalwarzen, and Raptak. The Raptak inscription very clearly mentions that the images of Kujula cat fishes, Vima Takto, Vima cat fishes, and his image or his statue were to be installed along with other deities. So this statue that we have, yeah, I have admitted all, then also, yeah. So this statue that we have is the Colossus seated image from Mat, is a statue of, this is the image of either Vima Tato or Vima catfishes. There is a confusion there, but as we see, the king is shown as, this is a statue that we've recovered from the dynastic century or the Devkul of Mat, and here we can see that the king, a life-size, this is a life-size statue, and the king is shown as seated majestically on the throne on a lion shape with a lion shaped support. So he's sitting on a Sinhasan. He's wearing a very, very typical Central Asian Skidi kind of a dress. These high boots are there. He's wearing a tunic, and the legs are in a pendant position. So this entire throne is also huge enough to kind of accommodate this lifestyle, this life-size statue. And the kind of impression that we get is other statue that we get from Mat is of Kanishka, and this Kanishka statue, yeah, again it's a lifestyle, it's a life-size statue. Here again Kanishka too is shown as wearing a Scythian dress, these heavy overcoat, which kind of gives a which creates an angular effect. His legs, his feet are splayed, and the military prowess of the king can be gleaned from the weapons that he's holding. So he's holding a mace or a long scepter here, which is resting on the ground, and he's holding the hilt of a sword here. So he's firmly grasping the hilt of a sword. So both these statues, especially this one, it is headless. We don't find the hands also, but it radiates strength. It exudes a lot of power and authority, and it radiates strength. So these statues were probably placed inside the sanctuary at Mat for worship. Kind of, they would have created a very, very majestic impression in the they would have created that awe-inspiring feeling among the people who saw these statues. Here, I would like to emphasize that the Kushanas always represented themselves as wearing this, wearing this different kind of a Central Asian Scythian kind of a dress. They are always shown wearing these long boots, the overcoat, the tunic, etc. This probably kind of emphasized their that distance between the ruler and the ruled. So that distance, which is very important in kind of creating the impression of of the kingship being something which is supreme, which is above the common people. So that is this deliberate attempt to distinguish themselves from the conquered people. So is more depicted in the Jalapatas also. This typical Scythian dress is something that remains there. We also find the...
Okay, ma'am. I think we are again going to log out very soon. So I would request everyone to join back using the same link. Okay, ma'am, you can continue till then. Okay.
So we also find that the Kushana started, the whole idea of agency of kingship is something which is discussed in the Kushana inscription. And if we look at this Shahaji Ki Dheri casket, we find this casket bears an inscription of Kushan of Kanishka, and we find a person wearing a Central Asian dress standing in the middle, and we find the moon god Miro with a crescent on one side, and the sun god Mihira with a radiating kind of a nimbus on the other. And in this casket, in this representation, what we find is that this person who is most probably Kanishka, he is being anointed by the sun god and the moon god. So the royal figure who represents Kanishka I is shown as anointed by the sun and the moon gods in this casket. So we know the agency from which they were getting their kingship was a divine agency. In the Raptak inscription, Kanishka claims to have obtained kingship through various deities. Like the opening line of the Raptak inscription says, Kanishka, the great deliverer, the righteous, the just, the autocrat, the god, one who is worthy of divine worship, one who has obtained kingship from Nana and all other gods. So Nana is the mother goddess of the Orient. So he proclaims that he has obtained kingship directly from Nana and other gods. And these other gods are mentioned in the later part of the inscription, where it is Ahura Mazda, Mihira, Uma. So very clearly it points out that the kingship has been given to the Kushana kings. They have received this kingship from the gods directly. So the agency of kingship is something which comes across very, very clearly in the Kushana inscription and the kind of representation that we find in the in the coins and different kind of objects, art objects that we find from the Kushana period. So clearly they tried to popularize the idea of divine kingship. They were trying to draw allegiance from their subject by exploiting their religious sentiments, and they also tried to set up a cult of the emperor, something which was there in the Roman Empire as well. They take the Kushana rulers, they assumed high sounding titles borrowed from different regions and civilizations. So to gain Shao Nano Shao and the Greek counterpart Vesalius Vesalion. So they were using all the languages that were known in their realm to kind of tell and convey to the people that the Kushana kings are Maharajas, Maharaja Rajatiraj, Devaputra Kushano. This is the kind of title that went in their inscriptions as well as in their coins. They also, in one of the inscriptions, an Ara inscription, which is a private record, Kanishka II is bestowed with the imperial title Caesar. So this Caesar is equivalent of Caesar used by the Roman emperor. So it's kind of suggests that they were kind of using the Roman ideology of kingship as well to legitimize their authority. Now, if we look at the Kushana coins, we find very clearly that they are using semi-divine delineations to kind of impress their people. The coinage under the Kushan had they had the most robust monetary system in early India. They had the coins were used for this to pay for the intercontinental trade that was going on. But very importantly, coins were also used as a medium of propaganda. Those the coins exchanged hands, and it is through them that the image of kingship was kind of disseminated to the common people. And we find that in these coins and the figures. So semi-divine features are seen on the coins, like in this coin of Bhima Cadphises, we see that there are flames emanating from his right shoulder. The kings are always diademed, that is, they are always having a, the diadem would mean something like this, a crown kind of a thing is there in their head. And in this coin, we can see flames emanating from the shoulder of the Bhima Cadphises. Then if we look at the other coins here, again, this is the coin of Kanishka. We find a lot of similarity between the way Kanishk is represented sacrificing at the altar, holding a spear, and the god on the reverse is represented. They are wearing almost similar kind of dresses. The fillet, which is seen flying on the obverse in the image of Kanishka, is similar to the fillet that we see on the reverse of the like when we look at the image of the gods and the goddesses. This is Otsho, that is the fire god. We find the kings are represented in the same kind of posture, wearing almost the same kind of dresses. So there is this deliberate attempt to compare the powers of the kings favorably with the divine powers of gods and goddesses, which were represented on the reverse with similar attributes. So what we find is, there is probably it's also an attempt to kind of confuse people, so that people, if you look at this, it's difficult to kind of differentiate between the king and the god. So so that was one of the mechanisms through which they tried to favorably kind of disseminate the image of the kingship, that they are almost like divine creatures. They are Devaputras, and they have attained their kingship or kingdom through divine agency, directly from the gods and the goddesses. In order to expand the the reach of their political message, they were using various languages. So we find the usage of Bactrian language and Greek. Certain new ideas, like the high sounding titles that come about with the Kushana dynasty, the issuing of dynastic coinage, usage of coins as a medium of disseminating ideas about kingship, and the imagery that we don't find any image of Ashoka. So when we look at the Ashokan pillars, there is no image of Ashoka as such. But when we come to the Kushans, we find that the Kushans are trying to disseminate the powerful images of the Kushana rulers, and a very semi-divine kind of an image through their coins and through the various kind of sculptures and art motifs like so now you can see the screen, I think. So this is the coin of Kanishka, and we find that there's a lot of similarity between the way Kanishka is standing and Acho, that is the fire god, is shown. There is similarity in their posture. There is similarity in the outer covering of they're wearing a tunic kind of a thing. There is this overcoat kind of a thing. Extended hand is there. The fillet, you can see the fillet flying over the shoulder. So it is a deliberate attempt to kind of disseminate an idea of a semi-divine person in the the Kushana kings were seen as semi-divine people, or probably son of God, or if we take the titles very seriously, they were seen as divine. Coin of Hovishka. Type of kind of
Ma'am, your network.
So again, talking about the coins of Hovishka, here we can see that we can see a nimbus around the head of Hovishka, and similarly there is a nimbus around the head of the gods and the goddesses on the reverse. So again, it's a semi-divine, semi-divine delineation where the king is shown as a semi-divine figure. In this other coin of Hovishka, in which he is shown, I mean, it's a disproportionate figure of Hovishka where he's shown as an elephant rider. So the entire idea is that during the Kushana period, they used Kushana coins as a medium of propaganda in which the kings, the Kushana rulers, were trying to propagate and disseminate an image of Kushana ruler as a semi-divine figure, someone who's seen on the coins and thus seen by his people as someone who's sacrificing at the altar, someone who's riding elephant. He is seen as his military power is seen in the form of different war weapons that these kings used. And on the reverse, we find a host of gods and goddesses from various cultures and religions that existed within the Kushana realm, and certain gods and goddesses which kind of represented ideas alluding to the right and might of the Kushana Empire were deliberately chosen by the Kushana kings. For example, deities like Pharaoh, a god personifying the Iranian concept of glory and legitimacy of king, is seen on the reverse of the Kushan kings. Then Shauraro, the other, yeah. So this is Shauraro. Shauraro representing the genius of the imperial might as well as the desirable kingdom. This one shows Heracles. Heracles is it's the Greek god personifying superhuman abilities. So these kind of gods were deliberately chosen by Kushana rulers, and an attempt was made to show the rulers and to kind of compare the powers of the rulers with those of the deities which are represented on the reverse of these coins. So we find there are certain major departures in comparison to the earlier period where they started issuing dynastic currency. So कुशानों का सिक्का चलता था और इन सिक्कों के माध्यम से उन्होंने एक बहुत ही शक्तिशाली राजा की जो कॉन्सेप्ट है उसका प्रचार प्रसार करने का प्रयास किया अपने पूरे राज्य में। जहां जहां सिक्का जाता था वहां पर लोगों को एक कुशान राजाओं की छवि नजर आती थी, जो कि एक दैवीय छवि है, मतलब सेमी डिवाइन है, अर्ध दैवी छवि है। और अपने इंस्क्रिप्शंस में तो वो अपने आप को देवी घोषित करते हैं। We don't know about the reverse mechanism. Actually, how much were they successful in kind of impressing people is something that is not very clear. But we know from the private donative inscriptions that in the private in these private inscriptions also, the kings are referred to as Devputra. So probably, and people, when they are making donations, they are kind of they are wishing well for the king, they are wishing they are wishing for the welfare or of the king, and they at times desire to share the merit of the donation with the king as well. So probably they were in a position to kind of impress their people through dissemination of a concept of kingship, where the king is seen as a divine being. So this is something which is a major departure from the earlier period. If we talk about continuity in the subsequent period, that is the Gupta period, we find that in the Gupta period also, the Gupta kings used coinage. So this is the coin of Kumaragupta II, where he's seen as he's seen riding a horse, and this is the coin of Kach Gupta. So in the Gupta period also, they continue with this policy of using coinage as a medium of propaganda, as a medium of disseminating powerful images of the coin. But in the Gupta period, that direct connection with divinity is something which is missing, and they try to kind of through various overt ways, they try to present the closeness of the Gupta rulers with the divine world. So like in the inscriptions, the Gupta ruler Samudragupta, for example, is compared with various gods, with Yama, with Kuber, with Indra, etc. But it's not that direct connection. He's not he's not directly seen as a divine being. So I think here I will end my lecture, and it's quite clear that the concept of kingship is a very, very evolving concept in early India, and it was not a static kind of a concept. And we find that the meaning of the king and the powers of the king changed from one period to another. Thank you.